Hello, I'm Dr. Brandt Gibson, and today I want to talk to you about a Jones fracture. A Jones fracture is a specialized fracture, and it's notorious because it does not heal or does not heal very well, and usually takes a long period of time to heal and can be very problematic. So it's important that you know what a Jones fracture is, and if you have that type of fracture, what your options are to treat it. So let me start with giving you the anatomy, a little bit of an anatomy lesson. The Jones fracture happens on the fifth metatarsal. So if you start from the first metatarsal, or the big toe, you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so it's the fifth metatarsal, and it's proximal fracture. So it's fractures down by the base that we're going to actually talk about here. For a Jones fracture, the fracture line has to go through the metaphyseal bone here. So you get the diaphyseal bone, metaphyseal bone, the metaphyseal bone, and it needs to go into the intermetatarsal joint. So it needs to go to the joint between the second and third, or the fifth and fourth metatarsal. So it needs to be going into that joint. If it's not going into that joint, it's not a Jones fracture. Why does that matter? Well, this is the area, the circulation comes into this area, and creating a fracture in that area cuts off a portion of the bone from blood flow. And so by cutting off a portion of that bone from blood flow, it's unable to heal because it can't get the nutrients it needs to the area, and it can't get the cells that it needs to the area, and because the blood flow is interrupted. So you get that Jones fracture right through that area that goes into the joint between the fourth metatarsal and the fifth metatarsal. That's a Jones fracture. If it's more distal, if it's more in the diaphyseal bone area, it's typically a stress fracture, and it's usually not a through and through fracture in that area. We've talked about stress fractures in the past. If it's more proximal, where it goes into the tarsal metatarsal joint, so it goes into towards the cuboid joint right there, that can be what's called a pseudo-Jones fracture. Sometimes it's misdiagnosed as a Jones fracture, but it heals much more easily because the blood flow is not interrupted to that area. It can also be an avulsion fracture, especially if it's a smaller portion. A lot of times you'll get an avulsion fracture where it's just a portion of that, and we'll talk a little bit more about those types of fractures tomorrow. So with a Jones fracture, it's a significant fracture. Fractures, as we've talked about before, usually take 6 to 8 weeks to heal. With a Jones fracture, when it does heal, it usually takes closer to 12 weeks to heal, and even at some times at that point, it's still not healing, not progressing, not doing what it needs to do. So if you have a Jones fracture in that area, there are a couple things you need to do. So one, let's kind of give you the whole story of what goes on, okay? Jones fracture, how does it happen, or what happens? What happens is you're pointing your toes and you turn your foot, and the idea is the styloid process, or this prominence right here on the bone, is where the tendons attach. The peroneal tendons pull on that area, and you can actually cause a fracture because of the way the foot's turned and the toes pointed and so forth, and it gets just enough stress that it cracks in that area. So because of that, you get pretty significant pain. It's usually pretty sudden, all of a sudden, and we do a x-ray, and it shows a fracture going into the fourth metatarsal, fifth metatarsal, intermetatarsal joint. So because of that, it becomes a Jones fracture, it becomes problematic. At the very least, you need to protect this bone. If you got this fracture, you need to protect it. Oftentimes they're casted or put in a boot. Oftentimes we don't allow you to walk on these because even the peroneal contracting at all can continue to pull on that fracture and make it harder for it to heal. Depending on the extent of that fracture, it is possible that some physicians will allow you to walk in a protected boot fashion where your foot's not moving at all. Now, that being said, these are notorious for not healing. And so it's common that you actually need to do some additional treatments, whether you're going to change the way you eat, whether you're going to add the herbal medications, the Dr. Christopher's bone and tissue to improve bone healing, whether you're going to use the MLS laser to improve bone healing, or even you can oftentimes get a bone stimulator for a Jones fracture because they know that they don't heal well. So you can actually get the bone stimulator to actually help it heal. There are multiple types, there are ultrasound bone stimulators that create an ultrasonic area there that stimulates the bone cells to heal, or electrical stimulation, same thing. by creating that electrical current across the fracture area, it causes the osteocytes to go to the area to grow new bone. So basically what you're doing is you're saying, okay, I need to do everything I can to stimulate and help this heal. A lot of times, however, with a Jones fracture, the quickest way to get it healed is to do surgery, where you actually go in and do some type of surgical treatment. There's a wide range of things you can do. Most of the time, you don't need bone grafts unless it's been a long period of time where it hasn't healed and you need to go in and clean up the area and pack it with bone of some sort to stimulate to heal. Most of the time, you don't necessarily need to do that. You can actually, oftentimes, even do it percutaneous, where you actually send a screw through that runs right down the shaft. So you basically send a screw that's goes into the bone and goes right down the shaft. And what it does, it creates rebar in the bone to support it while it heals. The advantage of that is you can get walking quicker, you can get moving quicker, and usually get it healed without too much trouble. The screw needs to be placed correctly. It needs to be the full thickness of the bone, basically, so it's hitting cortex on both sides, and it needs to be long enough that it's going past the fracture and stabilizes the whole thing, and you don't just create a fracture somewhere else from increased pressures. So the idea is you can be conservative and just put it in a boot and say it's going to take me a really long time to do this, boot or cast, and limit motion, all that kind of thing, and get it healed that way. You can add a bunch of things in between to speed up the process, or you can do surgery. Most of the time I take these to surgery to say, let's get this back to normal as quick as possible, get you back to the normal activities. So if you have a Jones fracture, or if you have a pretty significant injury on the outside of your foot and it really, really hurts, it's worth getting an x-ray to say, okay, is this a sprain or is this a true fracture? If it's a fracture, is it a Jones fracture that needs to be treated surgically and to help you get back to normal as quick as possible? This is Dr. Brandt Gibson, and this is your Podiatry Tips Day 80, the Jones fracture. This is an important fracture to understand. It's an important one to look at on x-ray. It's an important one to treat quickly and correctly to make sure you get back to normal as quick as possible. So have a good night, and hopefully you'll never have to be treated for the Jones fracture.